can we describe the principles, the fundamentals of one of the interesting systems you've developed, which is the Leglock system?
Yeah. Anything in particular, or just like a general understanding of what are some of the major principles of it?
Well, it's like me coming to Miyamoto Musashi and asking, can you describe the principles of sword fighting?
You're too generous. Let's start off with some context. When I began the sport of jiu-jitsu, I was taught a fairly classical approach to jiu-jitsu, which leglocks were a part of it, but not an emphasized part of it. The overall culture of the time, this is the mid-1990s, the overall culture of the time saw leglocks as largely ineffective. We were told that against good opposition, they just didn't work very well. They were low percentage techniques. We were also told that they were tactically unsound, because if you ever attempted them and you lost control of the leg lock, your opponent would end up on top of you or in some kind of good position, and you'd be in terrible trouble. And we were also told that they were unsafe, that if they were applied in the gym, there'd be far too many injuries and people would be badly hurt. And that was the received wisdom of that time. And so I didn't even work with them at all. And they would be shown occasionally in the gym, and you'd learn them, you drilled them. But in sparring, I showed no interest. You probably know that changed when I met the great American grappler, Dean Lister, who early in his career was using Achilles locks with considerable success. I met him in the gym. Wonderful fellow. And
Achilles locks is like a straight foot lock.
Yes, that's correct. Yes. And he went on to become a heel hooker and win 280 cc's later on in his career. But we never met again after that. And that opened some doors of inquiry. And
well, he asked this first principles question: is why would you only use half the body in a game
which
that
of course
involves
makes
the human body?
Perfect sense. So that opened doors to inquiry. And if you looked around the jiu-jitsu world at that time, the number of specialized leg lockers was very small, and most of them were from outside of conventional jiu-jitsu. For example, you could look around and see people like Romina Sato had sharp leg locks for that time period in the 1990s. So they were out there, they existed. And you'd see people like Ken Shamrock would use heel hooks in competition, and he had some good success with them. When I began experimenting in the gym, fairly soon certain truths started to become evident. And the most important of these can be understood very quickly, and they were relatively easy to discover. The first was that most people, when they went to understand and study leg locking, and when I talk about leg locking, I'm going to talk about one specific type, which is the most high percentage type. This is leg locks which are performed with entanglements of your opponent's legs with your legs. There are other forms of leg lock, but these are relatively low percentage and don't figure heavily in competition, so I'll ignore them. Most people made no distinction between the mechanism of control versus the mechanism of breaking. The heel hook is what ultimately breaks the ankle, but the mechanism of control is the entanglement of your legs to your opponent's legs. The Japanese term ashigarami literally just means like leg entanglement. It's a generic term. It could apply to any form of entanglement. There are many options. My idea was, let's focus on the entanglement first and worry about the breaking mechanism second. This was analogous to the idea of position before submission, only you couldn't talk about it in terms of conventional positions because ashigarami doesn't really fit into the traditional hierarchies, positional hierarchies of jiu-jitsu. So the the conversation was switched from position to submission to control to submission. Now, wrapping two of your legs around one of your opponent's legs gives you many different options. You can do it with your feet on the outside, so-called 50-50 variations. You can do it with your feet on the inside and form what we call inside foot position. There's pros and cons to both. There's also methods of harmonizing the two. So you have one foot on the inside and one foot on the outside. You can do it with a straight leg where you heel hook from the outside, or you can bring the leg across your center line and heel hook from the inside. You will start to notice as you work through these different variations that some present advantages over others. All of them come at a price. To some degree, regardless of which ashigarami option you use, there will be some degree of foot exposure on my part to my opponent and some degree of back exposure on my part relative to my opponent. So that's the downside of it. Variations within those different ashigarami enable you to lessen danger in some respects and at the price of gaining dangers in others. So you get this wide array of choices. There's not this kind of simplistic hierarchy that you see in the basic positions of jiu-jitsu, but there are hierarchies. I do, for example, generally favor inside heel hooks over outside heel hooks. If I feel my opponent is very good at exposing my back while I'm in ashigarami, I generally prefer 50-50 situations. If I believe my opponent is very good at counter leg locks, I generally prefer my feet on the inside, working with variations of inside sankaku, et cetera, et cetera. So there are broad heuristic rules that we can give to work in these situations. Once you start to understand there's a variety of entanglements you can use, then you start getting to the really interesting ideas that as you perform one given attack, one given heel hook, you can flow through different forms of ashigarami where you can create new dangers and avoid possible pitfalls in a very short time frame as you switch from one ashigarami to another over time, so that as your opponent's lines of resistance to an initial attack change, you can accommodate those by switching to another form of ashigarami, so that your mechanism of control is always pointing in opposite directions of his escape. And if you focus on this idea of control through the legs, you can completely change the nature of leg locking and take it away from what it was in the 1990s, an opportunistic method of attack based upon surprise, speed, and power, into one based on control. If you can do this, you can undermine many of the basic criticisms of leg locking, which were prevalent when I began the sport of jiu-jitsu. For example, if I can completely control and immobilize you, I can perform the lock very, very safely. If my only way of breaking your leg is to be faster and more powerful than you, 9 times out of 10, when I apply it, I'm going to hurt your leg, as much by accident as anything. But if I can completely immobilize you, and as every attempt you make to escape, I can follow you and immobilize you in new directions, then I can apply the lock with as much force or as little force as possible. And so you'll see in our training room, despite over considerably more than 2 decades, a decade and a half now of heel hooking using these methods, the number of people severely injured by heel hooks is tiny. Like I would say I've seen more people injured by far by kimuras in the time I've been training than I have by heel hooks, despite them having a similar twisting dynamic to them. If you build a culture where people focus on control rather than speed of execution, then the injury rate goes down appreciably. The whole idea of positional loss, everyone was critical of leg locks. Oh, if you go for leg locks and they don't work, well, now you're in trouble. The guy's going to be on top of you. They never make that criticism with arm bars. Okay, you can be in the mounted position, go for an armbar, end up on bottom, lose the armbar, and lose position. But I've never heard anyone criticize armbars on that account. More importantly, I believed from early on that the best place to attack leg locks is not top position, it's bottom position. You'll see that over 90% of my athletes attack leg locks from underneath people, not on top of people. So there is no positional loss. You're already underneath them. And so that criticism was null and void. And by focusing on this idea of breaking down and distinguishing between the mechanism of control and the mechanism of breaking, that created something new and something interesting. There was also another advantage that I had in terms of creating influence with leg locking. When you look at the great leg lockers of the past, they were basically iconoclasts. They were people who came out of nowhere who just had this remarkable success with leg locks. But they were just seen as unique individuals. They had their game and they were good at it. What was unique about the squad is you had not just one person, but a team of people who came out and did pretty much the same thing. These people had very different body types and very different personalities. So it wasn't that one kind of body type was good at it. You had tall people like Gordon Ryan. You had short people like Nicky Ryan. You had someone in the middle like Gary Tonin. You had fast people like Gary Tonin. You had slow people like Gordon. There was every kind of body type involved. And it was like people could see this was different because it worked for an entire team as opposed to a unique individual who had unique attributes. And that started to foster the belief that if it can work for a team, it can work for anyone, which means it can work for me. And I think that had a big effect. That's why I owe a lot to those early students, Gordon Ryan, Gary Tonin, Eddie Cummings, and Nicky Ryan. Those four kids came from nowhere. Gary had some success in grappling, like low-level success in grappling before becoming a full-time member of the squad. But the others were just nobodies who no one had known, and yet within a 5-year time frame, they were all going up against world championship competition and doing exceedingly well, and which gives further credence to the idea of the 5-year program. And I think by operating as a team, those young men did an incredible job of convincing the grappling world that this wasn't just about, well, they're just different, or it works for their body type or them as individuals. It was like, no, if a team can do it, anyone can do it. And I think that's what really convinced people that this was something worth studying. This is something that could be a big part of their lives.
But it also convinced you and convinced each other in those early days when you're developing the science. Essentially, what was missing is an entire science and system of leg locks, because it's not like you knew for sure that there's a lot here to be discovered in terms of control. You perhaps had, just like you said, an initial intuition, but you have to have enough. There's perseverance required to take. It's the Johnny Ive thing to take from the initial idea to an entire system. Is there a sense you have about how complicated and how big this world of control in leg locks is? How complicated is it? You've achieved a lot of success. You have a lot of powerful ideas in terms of inside, outside, what's high percentage, what's not, what's high reward, what's low risk, all those kinds of things. And then you also mentioned kind of not transitions, but how you move with your opponent to resist their escape through control. How much do you understand about this world?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question. As a general rule, the most powerful developments are always at the onset of a project. Okay, let's give an example. The jet engine was, I believe, first conceived in the late 1930s, just around the time of World War II. It was developed with great pace because of World War II. That obviously military research was a huge thing back then, and first fielded, I believe, by the Germans in around 1943. Um, Jet aircraft didn't play a big role in World War II. They were there at the end, and they did play a significant role, but in terms of numbers, they just weren't there. So by around 1945, you had the onset of the jet age, and the jet engine began to replace the piston engine in most aircraft. It was the new way of doing things. If you look at the pace of development of jet engine aircraft technology from 1945 to 1960, it is unbelievable. There was a solid decade where they were gaining almost 100 miles an hour per year for a decade. That's a form of growth that, I mean, in the world of engineering, that's the only time you see growth like that is in things like Bitcoin, and that's about it. Okay, uh, let's put things in perspective. Okay, in World War II, the standard U.S. aircraft bomber was the B-17, which was a mid-sized bomber with a fairly limited load capacity and I think top speed well below 300 miles an hour. Just 10 years later, you had the B-52, which could fly across continents and deliver nuclear weapons and carry bomb loads of up to 70,000 pounds. In a decade, that happened. I, if you took a B-17 pilot in 1943 and put them inside a B-52 a decade later, he would literally think he was on a UFO, a ship from another planet. That was the speed of development. Now contrast that with the speed of modern development. If I took you in a time machine and I put you in a civil airliner in 1972, let's say a Boeing 737, it's not that different from what you fly in today.
That's right.
Flies at the same speed, has the same range, flies at the same altitude. It's not that different. The amount of progress between 1973 and 2020 isn't very impressive. But the amount of progress from 1945 to 1955, or even better, 1960, was staggering. And so the initial progress tends to be meteoric. But after that, it tends to be incremental.
That
and you
said,
see that with Leglocks.
there's a guy named Elon Musk. There's been almost no development in terms of space rocket propulsion and rocket launches and going out into orbit or going out into deep space. And one guy comes along, one John Danaher type character, and says, it doesn't make sense why we don't use reusable rockets, why we don't make them much cheaper, why we don't launch every week as opposed to every few years. It doesn't make any sense why we don't go to the moon again over and over and over. It doesn't make any sense why we don't go to Mars and colonize Mars. It feels like it's not just a single jump to a B-52. It's a series of these kinds of jumps. So the question is there another leap within the leg locking system?
Time will tell. I do believe that we're in a phase now where the really big jumps have already been made, and we're in the incremental phase at this point. What I do believe is that you will start to see new directions start to emerge, where you start to see the interface between leg locking and wrestling, for example, the interface between leg locking and back attacks, and that will provide new avenues of direction, which will create new spurts of growth. But in terms of breaking people's legs, the simple act of breaking legs, I believe we're in the incremental phase now rather than the meteoric phase.